Hey guys, welcome back to another video. If you're new here, welcome. I'm Rini and I share DIY home decor videos on a budget. Today we're going to do some trash to treasure DIY projects which I'm really excited about. Upcycling gives a new life to something which we would have otherwise tossed out. It is also extremely budget friendly and great for the environment. So before we get started, I'd love for you to subscribe if you haven't already and click the bell icon to get notified every single time I upload a new video on my channel. So without further ado, let's hop right into the DIYs. For the first project, I reused this glass jar. I removed the label and the lid and washed it with soap and water. Then I took some jute twine and wrapped it around the neck of the jar. We want the length of the twine strands to be at least twice the length of the jar. Then I cut them to the desired length. After that, I tied a knot, making sure there was enough room to easily remove it or put it back on. Then I took it off and cut another piece of jute twine which had the same length as the other piece and folded it in half. I went to the opposite side of the first knot, put the piece underneath, pulled the loop over, and then pulled the strings through the loops and pulled it tight. I cut 3 more pieces of the same length, equally spaced them out between the first 2 knots and tied them to the main loop in the same way. I tried to maintain an uniform space of about an inch between each knot. I ran my fingers through the strands to separate them. I took 3 more jute pieces, folded them in half, and tied them to the main loop like so. So in total, we ended up with 8 knots uniformly spaced out around the main loop. Then I took the glass jar and put the loop around the neck of it. After that, it was very simple. I grabbed one of the strands from each side, made a knot, and pulled it tight. I continued repeating that all the way around, and we also want to check all the knots are kind of on the same level so it looks really nice and professional. After the first row was done, I repeated the same pattern, which was grabbing the strands from 2 adjacent knots and tying them together. The pattern I made looked like a fishnet. It was repetitive yet very satisfying to make. I continued building this pattern throughout, and once I reached near the base of the jar, I turned it over and tied a knot by grabbing 2 adjacent strands. That was the last row I needed to tackle. After that, I snipped off the extra twine. I tried not to cut them too short as it could undo the knots we made. I took another piece of twine, pulled it through all the loops to gather them together. Then I pulled the 2 ends tight and tied a double knot. After snipping off the ends, I went with my hot glue gun and applied a dab of hot glue on the knots to secure them. I also glued down the knots to the base of the jar to make them stay put. I grabbed 2 jump rings, attached them to the loop around the neck of the jar, and closed them back. I made sure the 2 jump rings were facing opposite to each other while attaching them to the twine. Then I used this piece of burlap, wrapped it around the neck of the jar to measure how much I needed and cut off the excess. I started to hot glue the burlap all the way around the neck of the jar. Since it had an uneven surface, I had to hold it for like 5 to 10 seconds till the glue cooled down. I also recommend going for Gorilla Hot Glue sticks for this since it has a better hold than the other ones. I cut off the extra burlap, and we want it to be nice and even while cutting it. And then I glued the last section and held it for a few seconds. To make a handle for it, I grabbed these wooden beads and some aluminum wire. First, I kind of estimated how long I wanted the handle to be, and based on that, I cut it to size with a wire cutter. Then I grabbed my pliers to bend the wire into a small loop and attach one end to the jump ring. I grabbed the other end and started to string the beads on the wire. I needed like 24 beads for this project, and they had a diameter of 1 centimeter. Then I cut off the extra wire, put the other end through the jump ring, cut it to size again, and bend the wire to make a loop to secure the beads. Since the wire was quite flexible, I kept on adjusting till I was happy with the way it looked. This finishes off our DIY upcycled glass jar tea light holder. It is such a cute and versatile piece. You can keep it in your patio, balcony area, or even on your living room coffee table. For our next DIY project, I used a small Ferrero Rocher chocolate box. I took off the label and washed it beforehand to get rid of any grease or glue residue on it. To paint it, I used this chalk paint in the shade Oatmeal. I was only painting the outside of the box, also I went for 2 layers of paint for a good and finished look. Then I grabbed this piece of cork sheet, cut a small square piece out of it, and I further cut it diagonally to get 2 little triangle pieces. I took 2 dowel pieces and glued the triangles onto them. I was going to use these as a stamp since the cork triangles had a beautiful texture on them. I also used these 2 black and white acrylic paints. After that, I dipped one of the stamps in black acrylic paint. I was testing it out first on the paper. I got rid of the excess paint around the edges and pressed the stamp on the surface of the box. I was placing the stamp randomly on the box. I also pressed the edges to transfer the shape of the triangle onto the surface. Then I dipped the other stamp into white acrylic paint and started to press it onto the lid. After a couple of tries, I figured the best way to get a clean result is by making sure the entire stamp is covered with paint, removing the excess paint around the edges, and pressing all 3 edges after pressing the stamp onto the surface. I was trying to rotate the triangles in different directions to give it a fun pattern. I took a detailing brush dipped into the same oatmeal chalk paint to clean up the edges and to cover up any mistake. Then I took the small knob and attached it with some hot glue to the center of the lid. You can use super glue or E6000 if you like. I held it in place till the glue cooled down. I was loving the way how a chocolate box turned into a cute little organizer. To seal the paint, I grabbed a polyurethane varnish and applied a coat of it. For the last DIY project, I used a cardboard tube from my old carpet. I also took another empty roll of kitchen towel. This was a little bit wider than the other tube. First, I took the cardboard tube and measured the length I wanted to go for, which was around 30 centimeters. I marked it a few more times around the tube to cut it evenly. Then I took my washi tape and following the markings, I taped around the tube. With the help of my handsaw, I started to cut right below the tape. I removed the tape and sanded it down a little bit. Then I took the empty kitchen roll, marked the center of it, placed the other cardboard tube that we cut before right in the center and traced around it. The easy way to do it is to place the tube right above the other and trace along the edges. Then I used a box cutter to cut into it following the Sharpie outline. The reason why I used an empty kitchen roll is because it was easy to cut through it just by using a box cutter. Also, I recommend cutting just a bit above the outline to make it fit easily. I cleaned up the edges a little more and then I took the cardboard tube and stuck it into the other one. I made sure it was properly aligned and I took my hot glue gun, filled in the gaps with hot glue, and this secured everything in place. I used the metal nozzle of my glue gun to sort of smooth out the glue a little bit for a more finished look. Then I grabbed a piece of cardboard and traced along the edges of both the sides of the tube, and I also numbered them to identify which side they belonged to. And then I cut the circles out and attached them to each end with hot glue. I used joint compound and started to apply it onto the surface. I applied it generously and smoothed it out with my fingers. It doesn't need to be very smooth, we want to go for a textured surface using the spackle. We also want to apply it to the sides and all the nooks and crannies. Once it was completely dry, I gave it a light sanding with my sanding sponge, and we want to go very light-handed with this. You can definitely skip this step if you want. Then I used white acrylic paint and applied 2 coats of it. After the paint dried out, I used this chalk paint in the shade Oatmeal. I took a tiny amount of paint on the brush and dry brushed it onto the surface. And then I took a damp clean brush and blended it out a little bit to smooth the stickiness of the paint. After I dry brushed the paint, I instantly blended it with a damp brush before the paint dried out. Also, I cleaned the brush each time to get a very subtle texture. For the base of the jewelry holder, I took an MDF square piece from dollar store. Then I painted it with a black acrylic paint and I went for 2 layers of paint. I also painted the sides, and you can totally avoid the back side since it won't be visible. After the paint dried out, I used my ruler to draw 2 diagonal lines from the opposite corners, and the point of their intersection was the center of the square piece. Then I took the tube and placed it right on the top of the X mark, and before gluing it down, I made sure it was correctly positioned. I traced around the edge of the tube and I used my Gorilla Super Glue to attach it to the base. We also want the side of the square piece to be parallel to the horizontal cardboard tube, if that makes sense. This completes our DIY upcycled cardboard tube jewelry holder. I am so glad how beautiful this piece turned out. That's all for today, and I really hope you enjoyed the DIYs. And if you did, let me know in the comments below which one was your favorite. My personal favorite is the jewelry holder. I think it turned out so much better than I envisioned, and I couldn't be more happy about it. You can also follow me on Instagram at DustyHues. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be seeing you guys in my next one.